So, what do you do with your students?
I try to help them.
Shall we turn off the video?
Why?
No, that's all it is, right?
Well, what it means is that with age and experience, like teachers in general, I assume, since very few of us are born teachers,
Oh,
we shape our intuitive understanding of what we need to bring to a student by our intimate conviction that what we hear lacks of something that we can bring, that we define ourselves in our head. And with experience, the process of this, if you want, acceptance, agreement, and transmission is more streamlined. So I don't know if I bring something to the student is what the student expects. If the student understands how I address the situation, or does it take for the student long time enough to trusting study with me to understand what I try to get at through the student's progress, for the student himself. Because there is one thing I respect the most as a teacher, is the different morphology of the piano students. Not all students address the instrument with the same way physically, because they're not built the same way. And so it would be easy to compare and contrast with my approach. But I try to think being in the body of the student. For instance, the stretch of the hand, the length of the fingers, the disposition of the keys, the weight distribution between the shoulder and the arm. All these kind of things have, in the beginning, I was not aware how much I could help. And now I think I can streamline directly the help by addressing immediately the physiological
differences.
Oneness with the piano.
Oh.
I find that most students fight the instrument or fear the instrument in producing the music. And I try to make them as comfortable in terms of their fingerings, phrasing, directions of their own arm positioning, so that they can be, yes, more precise, because the wrong note is the obvious factor, but also extract musically the phrasing that they would like to hope to wish, but they might not even be aware of it. So they have to trust me to bring them there.
Right.
And it takes sometimes longer than the academic time of a school. It's like you harvest, but the results of the harvesting are seen after you've left.
You know, sorry to use myself as a reference example. I have this conviction that since studying with you, and because the way I converse with you, our chemistry and our deep lying understanding, it makes me the best student, but also the worst student to teach. For the reason that I'm open and understanding of almost any perspectives that any teacher gives me. But at the same time, I'm extremely critical because of all these perspectives.
So, on choice, would you prefer to have none and come up with yours? Or do you prefer to receive many and make a choice of which works for you?
Therefore, it comes a moment, as exemplified by last night in the mock performance. I choose the moment I receive a comment, and I choose what to listen and what not to listen. Because at the same time, I believe that too much information can be detrimental. In a way, I hope that I'm not wrong, that I in a way exemplify what you want in a student. wanted to do with the student, wait a second, which is the student, the purpose of a teacher is to not exist.
By essence, the teacher doesn't exist because there's an imprint of the teacher's views of the music that exists through you.
Oh, yeah, of course.
But not the teacher himself or herself.
You're talking about imposition.
Well, inevitably, when you play, you're a combination of things that struck you, either by intellectual understanding from a teacher, either by imitation from a pianist you like to hear, either the piece itself that calls you to play it in a way that even your teacher did not suggest. So it's not a streamline directly from the teacher to the student, because then you'll be just some kind of a clone. I don't believe in cloning the teaching. Now, of course, I have been challenged with rambunctious students such as you, who have a very independent thinking. And I don't believe in yes men or yes women, because the inevitably asymmetrical situation between the teacher supposed to know and the student supposed to accept the knowledge, at least at the lesson, regardless after that, what you do with all this after. I still believe that when the student shows independence of thinking, it can be also provocative, it can become very difficult. Sometimes the teacher has to say, could you please allow me to teach you too also? Because inevitably, at a certain level of technique, you develop a certain way of believing in the piece you play.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not always expecting or asking to be spoon-fed the piece. Now, if some people can separate the technique from the music, then they can have a teacher who would be more like a coach or a trainer, who spoon-feeds you how to play it. But the playing itself remains your domain. That's what you do usually if you do sports. You train daily with a coach, but you have a trainer who tells you how to develop your sportive gesture towards a given competition. And so the strategy and the daily work, the trust in the technical translation on the piano playing of the musical thoughts that you have or that you're given against your will, because sometimes they go against your will. At some point, you just merge them all into your personality.
I have a brilliant observation now. Most teachers give views, their view of how they see you. Your approach is to give perspectives, which therefore you said the teacher essentially does not exist, because the perspective is in the student's brain anyway. And I realized, so if I say that, okay, I'm developing my own perspective, so do I at all should play for anyone? And then I realized I should. Because even if I have my own perspectives, I can see what people view.
Pedagogically, you would be told that the right teaching is not to open more perspectives,
Oh, really?
but to discipline your original undisciplined action as a student. By essence, you are in front of the chaos of nature, and we have to shape your playing so you can do exactly what you're supposed to do in our eyes as a teacher. And so you have the directive teaching that tells you what not to do. It's like, there's so many paths, but you're going to choose this path because, trust me, I know where it leads you right. And for the student to know, I've noticed in teaching, very interestingly, that when a student doesn't do something right, the teacher says, do it again, and tells more or less what to achieve, example or in words, or both. And then comes the point where the teacher said, that's better. And then you continue in the piece.
Yeah.
And very often the student thinks, what was better? How can I do it better every time on that spot?
Mm.
And it's very difficult because the student is trying to get to where the teacher wants to bring him, but doesn't know exactly where that is.
Mm.
And so if there is a trust, then and time, you develop the understanding for that.
Mm.
But if not, usually the pedagogical approach is to just give simple rules with a lot of forbidden things.
And direct instructions.
If I say all trills start with the upper note in Baroque and after that on the real note, it's a way to set a rule. And all rules are exemplified by their exceptions. But in order to allow yourself an exception, you have to be given a rule. So if I say play in tempo, and then one day I'll say, but now try to play rubato, is because I know you can play in tempo, so you can play rubato and go back merge on tempo. But if I say play rubato from the get-go, then you'll zigzag through and you'll be always too much or not enough. In other words, I think the pedagogical approach with a student who is very either intuitively strong musician, either has already from other instructions a very strong idea of what they want to do, it's very hard to direct. But if a student says, is that the right tempo? Am I supposed to put as much pedal? How am I supposed to play the ornaments? The answer is this way, that way. And if the question is answered and implemented, then the student is supposed to sound right according to the teacher's idea. The problem is that what makes all of that hold together is your own musicianship, your integrity. So of course some teachers teach easier students who already have a musical drive, and other teachers teach better students who don't have one and need to be told what to do. And I am not very good at spoon feeding.
Do you know?
I am more interested in suggesting alternative paths.
Yeah.
And a combination of which becomes the student's own. And it might take longer than the time they study with me. I remember I had a student who came to tell me she wants to play 109, and she played very, 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 very carefully well. And I remember I told her, Beethoven's sonata is not prettyful, Beethoven's sonata is meaningful. Play meaningful. And it's something I never did say before to a student. It just happened with this student that day, because I realized that no matter how pretty you can play, that doesn't mean that the envelope justifies the essence. And when you speak about Beethoven's sonata, by essence, you play a thought of Beethoven, dressed up in a sonata form. And I think that if I take this approach, inevitably, I postpone the result. If in result of somebody playing very prettifully, I say, that's very good. Let's continue this for next week, thinking by her or himself, this student will reach that depth by experience, by self-experience. So the philosophical question in teaching is, does my advice shortcut the progression, which will happen, or does my advice confuse the progression? And sometimes I feel like if I give advices, fingerings, phrasings to avoid this, to avoid that, perhaps I make you avoid things that you haven't yet experienced colliding in. Of course, if you trust, then it's okay. But if you don't, then you wonder, why am I supposed to do this? Why not that way? And give an example. When I spoke earlier about the morphology, my thumb is very thick compared to a black key, which is very thin on the piano. So I always avoid the thumb on the black key. And when I see you play and you put the thumb on the black key, it's thinner than my pinky. And so inevitably you have no problem of stability on your thumb on the black key. So this is kind of thing where you don't teach like you play. You teach like the student will play. And so you have to constantly think about how they approach with their physicality, how they approach with their intellectual construction of the piece, and how long you have to help, hope, shape that construction for the piece for the student. When you know ultimately the student will build it by themselves. But at which point and how does the student merge all this information into their playing? That is the mystery that I think the teachers don't hold. It's not a puppet and puppeteer. It's really about transmitting intelligent thought process.
I have a sad question to ask. Honestly, what if the student come to you at whatever age, and he or she honestly may not have the talent or the intellectual capability to understand your method?
I adapt my language.
Okay.
I really do. At least I try. I don't think my method and their intellect. I try to think, what can I do to reach them?
Just now you were talking about avoiding things. So remember I learned the Scrabble fifth with you 5 years ago. So for a short period of I went to Hong Kong to play with my another professor from Hong Kong. And he told me, oh, this is a little bit too much. You can tone down because it's too much of that place. And but he said, he laughed. But you know, it's good to also experience the extreme before you come back. Because his implication is, most other students avoid the experimentation and they come to a certain confinement too early. And I'm actually quite proud of that.
Well, most of the problem is that the student doesn't know by intuitive knowledge what is the right path of the stylistic fact. And so when you experience extremes, you bounce from one to the other until you find the right middle. But that right middle is not defined. It's something that you sense.
Yeah.
And I think that when you speak of a piece like Scriabin Fifth, which is a piece of excesses in terms of expression, or you play a Haydn sonata, which by essence it's more about organizing the chaos of nature in structures that are very objective. The sense of playing it without extremes is more obvious. So when you play a piece that is by essence written to the extremes of the expression, from the whisper to the scream, and a piece where it's always spoken in the middle of the voice expression, in terms of expressive projection, I think you learn a lot about framing yourself stylistically.
Yeah.
And I find that when most people play piano in terms of the physicality of it, like athletically, they play first piano and then the piece. They play piano and then they play Scriabin piece, or they play piano and then they play Haydn piece, to take an example of contrasting styles. But in a way, the style definition for the sound projection, the legato, the articulation, and all that, doesn't bother them. They just have to first put the right amount of weight on the right amount of fingers to play all the notes. And that's why I don't believe in people who say, first I learn the notes, then I learn it from memory, then I'll add interpretation, like layers on a sandwich, and then I'll perform it from memory. I think that if it doesn't sink in at once, you don't have enough of these situations where the learning process of the notes should already bring you to an organization of the psychological interpretation of the section. And even if you're genuinely wrong, the teacher should be happy that you come with certain drive. And if you don't have such a drive, then the teacher has to spoon-feed it. So the problem is, if you play outside of the frame that is defined invisible frame by the teacher or the style of the knowledge of it, or if you do it by imitation of other people playing, but within the frame. That's why I like to say that when you play a piece and you see the bar lines, inevitably you think in bar lines. And if it's published without bar lines, you'll think more about phrasing directions. But so the bar lines are there for practical reasons, but not musical reasons. If the listener hears you play the bar line separations when you perform a piece, then I think it's a terrible thing. But the performer has to organize themselves and feel that they're free in the expression, so the listener doesn't feel that you're bound by the boundaries. And so the teacher is sort of like the insurance agent. You buy a sports car to impress, and the insurance agent says that will be the price of driving it crazily. So in a way, I should entice you. Go ahead, go to the extreme. Use the maximum speed. No, as an insurer, I'll say, drive it safely, because this way you have a bonus on your insurance. You don't drive a car as a bumper car in the streets, even if you pay the insurance for it. So I think that enticing a student to go to the extremes is very dangerous. And I think it has to be only done if the teacher trusts in their instinct that the student has in themselves this combination you said about being obedient but also rambunctious. And I find that if the student doesn't have the desire to break the rules, and the teacher has not the right way to hold them within the rules, then there is no energy between the two. If the one implements and the other one orders, I think it doesn't go very far in the music making. And during the lesson, it's almost even, except that one has more experience than the other. And when you listen to a student perform in concert, and you're the teacher, you really feel like the remote control lacks batteries. Or the puppeteer doesn't have any action on the puppet.
Like last night, it's your first time hearing in a full concert in 5 years, no?
But every time I hear a performer that I know I don't, I immediately sense the intentions and the results. In every little micro detail of shifting, depending, lifting, taking time, organizing. Regardless, I like to hear you play with the appetite for playing that you developed in your performance publicly. You play with total appetite. You're taken by the piece and you played at your fullest and you enjoyed fully, and that's what the enjoyment of you eating your meal with appetite makes us feel like that must be a good meal, I would like to eat it too, right? So I think that kind of sharing is very appealing. And of course, because I'm a piano teacher, I deform my hearing by the technical aspect of it. And I find myself hoping that the interpretation goes to its extreme choice of the students, or therefore performers, former students' intention. And when I hear you play triple pianissimo some of your Grieg pieces, I think at some point he'll take off the una corda and try to feel the airs of the lung and then go down back diminuendo. And sometimes I think, okay, he wants to frame that in such color that he's going to remain in it for the whole piece. So I don't inject my wish of how you play in your playing. It's just I analyze in real time your intentions. Sometimes I'm agreeably surprised. And sometimes I think that the fact that you play a piece like the Fifth Sonata by Scriabin 5 years after having learned it gives you a perspective of flying over the complete view of the piece while detailing all the performance, which you couldn't have had in the first time when you were exploring the piece. And so then teaching is in a way, as I said, you plant grains, but you harvest later. And I think that you will play this sonata with a different perspective in 10 years from now, that will englobe what you already do?
Let's hope so.
Your students will know.